for small, very small shops, in this case, 2K shops, if you have individuals that are sharing your household, children or whatnot, and they share devices on, say, different profiles, or if they're around your business operations in your IT, what kind of risk profile does that provide? And the answer is very high if you're sharing a device with a different profile, okay? So we would like to think logically when we have separate profiles on a digital device, they're like totally different devices. And there are what we call virtual barriers in place, logical barriers, that's the IT term for it. And the idea being that for the data to move from one side to another, it has to go through quite a few different hoops. But the reality is the target in that case is not going to be the actual hardware and the device separating that data from the outside world. The target is going to be, can I get a worm on this machine, or a virus or malware or ransomware? And then once I do, all I need to do is be able to hit that operating system, that basic part of the computer that makes it run and present everything for us, and lock it out. So your children sharing that device to you becomes a target that's in most cases not going to be as scrutinous of certain things. And then if they get hit and that computer gets bricked or locked out, then you're out too. So one of the things we'll talk about, and we'll talk about this in a couple slides, is if they don't need access to the machine or the data in your company, they should not have access. So now I understand for smaller companies, and everyone comes from such diverse backgrounds, and the industries represented today are across so many different avenues of production and service. I understand that these are things that sometimes you can't get away from, especially when you're first starting out. I don't want you to feel like you're doing anything wrong or be discouraged. What I want you to think about instead is as you grow, as resources become available to you to mature, that these are things you begin to want to address. Because when you're first starting a business, the goal is to keep the business running and to get it to grow. And then as you mature, I want you to begin to think of risk management. And we'll talk more about what risk management looks like, but your risk management changes through the life of your business, right? Like what constitutes a critical risk to the business is going to adjust. We talked about how you can have data scattered throughout your infrastructure and not know exactly where it is. And the question becomes, how do you begin to get your arms around it? Well, there's a couple different ways. The first thing is if you have an IT provider or an IT partner, engage with them in talking, and first just a conversation with your IT department. How's our data being used? What's happening? And they're going to probably give you a bunch of feedback about users. Well, this guy he just saves everything locally. I was actually that guy and I shouldn't have been. I like to work off my local machine. It was a bad thing. But the point being is like there's everyone in your organization, especially if you work in manufacturing, I've learned engineers are the problem children everywhere. When your IT guy begins to talk to you about how your engineers are busting your processes, or you have someone in customer sales who just doesn't follow the normal process, you need to think to yourself like, yes, I value this employee and I want them to have certain autonomy, but on the other hand, like I need to protect my business, right? And you need to start to take this seriously and listen to what's happening operationally within your business. So what's that mean? And we'll talk about that right now. We need to decide how exposed that data is. So now we've talked about finding out where it is. We're talking to our IT providers. We're beginning to look at this through our data's eyes and follow our process, where that data lives. If people are pulling it off of shared drives or out of OneDrive or out of Dropbox or whatever we're using, and they're sharing it locally or saving it locally, or if we have tons of attachments all in our email, and our email is like pages and pages of attachments and 10 million folders, which is also me. We want to know what that is. And now we're going to talk about exposure. Like, what is the exposure to the outside world? So there are a couple different ways. Situational risk or exposure is data that is at rest most of its time. And what's that mean? It means it's data that sits on our system, but we're not using it often. Okay, this is probably like really old invoices or like HR documents that we fill out once and then we just store for periods of time, things like that. Promotions that we might have run a year ago that we want to keep and be aware of and have copies of, but we don't actually use all the time. This also, however, becomes stuff where, like I said with HR, you have PII, personally identifiable information, which might not impact your business directly bad, but it impacts your employees really bad. And that can also, if it's client PII, there's legality involved and it's all kinds of stuff. So depending on your industry, you also might have like regulations or processes that you need to meet in order to be in that industry. You might need to hold records for a certain amount of time. You might need to retain certain things for long periods of time. That's probably this data. There's functional exposure, and that's data that resides within the system and is required for certain business functions. This might be purchase orders that are worked on and then left and then pulled up and worked on again, product sheets, that detail what you were providing or building, inventory sheets that you update as a job is completed or progressed, things like that. So this is data that is moving through the system, but kind of like functionally. And then you have persistent exposure. And this data that is constantly in use. This tends to be data like drawings, diagrams, recipes, things that are constantly being pulled up and referenced and used to build service or whatever your clients. And each of these have built within them different exposures. So the two big ones are the ones that bookend functional data. So situational data becomes very, very vulnerable because you tend to forget it exists. You tend to leave it. And we're going to talk about how you can lock some of this down and begin to address it. And then persistent data is the stuff that's always cycling around. So if I'm an attacker, there's two things I'm going to see first. I'm going to see the data that's just sitting there, and I'm going to go through it because that's probably where I can live for a while without you noticing I'm there, because you don't frequently access these files. And then I'm going to see the stuff that's constantly moving through the system. And then the functional stuff in the middle, I'm going to try and work my way towards. Where are we at in this process as a business owner? Well, we've started to engage with our IT providers and identify our critical data. And we've classified some of this data now, hopefully. You've already in your minds come up with an idea of what's critical to my business, what can I absolutely not operate without, and then where is it, you know? And then the next question is, what is the exposure of this data? Like, how frequently is it in my system? How often are my employees pulling it up, moving it around, printing it out? Now we have an idea of what that is. And now we're going to start to say, okay, so what am I going to do, right? How am I going to make this better? And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about who should be accessing the data, right? And we should have control over who accesses this data. Ideally, it's only people that work for you. Then we're going to talk about the principle of least privilege. And that summed up really quickly, and we'll talk more in depth about it, is if they don't need it, they shouldn't have it. It's really that simple. And then we're going to talk about data storage considerations, both physical and digital. And I added physical on here actually as an addendum because it occurred to me as I was doing my assessment, so many times I would walk through companies and I'd be like, all right, where do you hold your data? And they'll be like, well, we have it all in these network shares. You know, we got a server and these are the server folders. And I'd be like, great, let's take a look at that. And then they'd be like, oh, and then also we have this filing cabinet room over here, and it's got 320 boxes of, you know, customer invoices in them and product diagrams and things like that that we also store. And it's like, okay, well, so you've got data everywhere. And, you know, we'll talk about that too.